Hello there, my name is Hido and welcome to the Pantheon, where in Innistrad the spoilers are over, but I'm going to continue churning out videos. And we've got a rather interesting one, something truly horrifying. It's a 5-mana 1/1. It's Umbris, Fear Manifest. 5 mana for a Nightmare Horror. 1/1 gets +1/+1 for each card your opponents own in exile. Whenever it or another nightmare or horror enters the battlefield under your control, target opponent exiles cards from the top of their library until they exile a land card. So really this is all about the mill, but we're going to end up with an absolutely colossal commander. Getting cards into exile of your opponents is actually, quite easy. So this is really quite a cool card to build around. And who doesn't love making your opponents miserable with mill? I certainly do. And, what else makes me miserable? People subscribing to my channel. Wait, no, the opposite. Please subscribe to my channel. I'm going to be making videos like this for every legendary creature, and dear God, there's a lot of them. So come and join me on the journey. But without further ado, let's have a look at my top 5 for Umbris. And in number 5, well, what do we have? We've got Consuming Aberration, a horror. And this is all a horror themed section, Oh, it's like a horror movie, except it's collectible cards. This is all about mill and horror archetype, because we want to be exiling as many cards, playing horrors, things like that. But mill works perfectly with this commander, with a couple of cards that is going to come up. 5 mana for a star horror. Its power and toughness are each equal to the number of cards in your opponent's graveyards. Whenever you cast a spell, each opponent reveals the cards from the top of their library until they reveal a land card, then puts the cards into their graveyard. Now that sounds quite similar to my commander, isn't it? It's exactly the same, except it's putting it into the graveyard. But that's fine, because guess what? We can exile things from graveyards. Another couple of great horrors here. Sewer Nemesis. 4 mana star and enters the battlefield. Choose a player. Its power and toughness are each equal to the number of cards in that chosen player's graveyard. Whenever your chosen player casts a spell, that player puts the top card of their library into their graveyard. So it can work pretty counterintuitively with a couple of cards we're going to talk about, where we exile the whole graveyard and this will just die. But it's a great card for setting up, and it just allows us to keep milling. Or we could put it on ourselves and keep milling ourselves, because we've got a couple of flashback cards we can play from the graveyard. This card just fits all around. Then there's Forexian Rager. 3 mana 2/2 horror. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. It's just a horror. It's a nice, simple card. I like putting cards like this. It's like a nice filler, curve, sort of smoother. We can put this in on 3. We can just play this. We draw a card, get it deeper into the deck, and it's a horror, so it fits the archetype. Then there's Grazalax. Lithid Scholar? These words are nonsense. 3 mana for a 3/2 horror. Whenever a creature you control becomes blocked, you may return it to its owner's hand. That's fantastic with all the horrors, because then we can cast them again, get the trigger off our commander, exile more cards from an opponent, and whenever one or more creatures you control deal combat damage to play, draw a card. So a nice bit of card advantage as well. And the artwork, look at him, he's just eating someone's lovely, delicious brain. And those are some cool horrors that you could potentially play in your deck. That brings me on to number 4, and at number 4 we've got Mill, or this specifically is Exile Mill. Tasha's Hideous Laughter. 3 mana for a sorcerer. Each opponent exiles cards from the top of their library until that player has exiled cards with a total mana value of 20 or more. So if you sit down at a CEDH pod, everyone's really extremely streamlined, everything got 1 and 2. This could potentially mill their entire deck. But you're going to get quite a few cards into exile, and that'll just grow our commander exponentially. Really, really great card. And for just 3 mana, you're going to get so much power and toughness and so many cards exiled. Really great card. Then there's Increasing Confusion, one of the cards with flashback I talked about earlier. 1 blue and X, sorcery. Target player puts the top X cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. If it was cast from the graveyard, that player puts twice that many cards into his or her graveyard instead. So it is only targeted, but we could use this on ourselves. We could use it on opponent to potentially kill them. And it's just a big X spell. Black can make a ton of mana. This card can mill until the cows come home. Or milk. Maddening Cacophony. Often listening to me results in this. 2 mana for a sorcery. Kick it for 4, so you can pay 6 mana. Each opponent mills 8 cards if you're just paying 2. If the spell was kicked, instead, each opponent mills half their library rounded up. Whew, that's pretty goddamn good. You can mill everything in your opponent's library if you've got some kind of doubler. But if you've got a way to exile the graveyard, that's putting a ton of cards into the exile. And a lot of people don't play out of the graveyard. So this is just going to remove those cards forever and make them utterly miserable. Then there's Mesmeric Orb, one of my favourite artifacts. 2 mana for an artifact. Whenever a permanent becomes untapped, that permanent's controller mills a card. Ooh, that's really, really nice. It includes lands, so every time you're untapping your lands, you're going to be milling, but so are your opponents. So that big green ramp player who's got 28 permanents, they've only got like 3 turns left to live because they're just going to be milling everything into the graveyard. Absolutely wonderful card for this style of deck. Puts tons of cards into the graveyard, and then we can take advantage of that. And, we've put all these cards into the graveyard, and at number 3, we got ways of exiling those graveyards to make our commander absolutely massive. And Leyline of the Void is probably the best one. 4 mana for an enchantment. If it is in your opening hand, you may begin the game with it on the battlefield. So you just go, I've got a free Leyline. And if a card we put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. So all this mill is putting it straight into exile, which is buffing our commander massively, making it absolutely enormous. Phenomenal card because it doesn't stop your own graveyard. It's only opponents, so you can still keep up with your graveyard shenanigans, your reanimation, your flashback, things like that. Wonderful card in the deck. Then there's Callous Blood Mage. Oh, everything seems to have gone black. Oh, I'm back. 3 mana for a 2/1 Vampire Warlock. When it enters the battlefield, choose 1. Create a 1/1 black and green pest creature token. So a nice little blocker early in the game. You may draw a card and lose 1 life. So again, like I was talking about with a horror, yes, this doesn't trigger our commander because it's not a horror. This can, just smooth out those draws. Then finally, exile target player's graveyard. So if we've milled tons of cards, well, now we can exile all of them, which is very, very nice. Then Ashiok's Dream Render, 3 mana, 5 loyalty planeswalker. Spells and abilities your opponents control can't cause their controller to search their library. So that's really, really backbreaking, and I have forgot this card was on the field a lot of times. And, cracked a fetch land. Oh, I can't find anything. That's great, isn't it? Then -1, target player puts the top 4 cards of the library into their graveyard. Then exile each opponent's graveyard. So this mixes the graveyard mill and also the exile. So this is going to just hose so many strategies. Really, really great card. Yes, it can die to combat damage, but we can get a couple of massive blockers. Say our commander's on the field. It's 98. I think it's probably going to be blocking most things. Then a land that does something I love, and Bajuka Bog. When it enters the battlefield, it enters tapped. And it enters the battlefield, exile all cards from target player's graveyard. Tap for a black. Ooh, so good. Having a land with an ability like this is just phenomenal. This could potentially pump your commander by +20/+20 if you're targeting the right graveyard. Oh, amazing. It just feels so good to really cripple someone with a land. And that brings me on to number 2. And at number 2, we've got all these cards in exile now. Let's make use of them. And this is one of my favourite sort of uses of them. And they're a bunch of cards which, in EDH, they're not that powerful. But in situations like this, they're great. They're the Eldrazi Processors. 4 mana for a 2/3 Devoid Eldrazi Processor. So it has no colour. It's got flash and flying. And when it enters the battlefield, you may put 2 cards your opponents own from exile into their owner's graveyard. If you do, counter target spell. So that's amazing. For 4 mana, you're getting a Venser, except it doesn't bounce the spell. It just, stops it completely. And we're using the cards in exile. This is just such a good fusion of abilities here. It just works wonderfully. Great, great flavour. I love the artwork on this card as well, like that Eldrazi thing that's going and making sort of I don't know what happened, but it looks pretty cool anyway. So really cool card and fits wonderfully. Then there's the Blight Herder, 5 mana for a 4/5 Processor Eldrazi. When you cast it, you may put 2 cards your opponents own from exile into their owner's graveyard. If you do, put 3 1/1 color sign creature tokens onto the battlefield that have sacrifice the creature, add the colours to your mana pool. So yes, okay, the processing, putting things into your graveyard It will make your commander slightly smaller, but you're getting 3/1/1s that ramp you by 3 mana. It's amazing. It's just such a cool ability, and it works fantastically in the deck. Then there's Wasteland Strangler, 3 mana, 3/2, devoid, it's colorless. Then it enters the battlefield. You may put a card for your opponent owns from exile into its owner's graveyard. If you do, target creature gets -3/3 until end of turn. That will kill quite a few commanders. You'd be surprised at just how many it kills. And, you know, it could hit like a potentially game-winning card, you know, Llanowar Elves, something like that. But it's a great card to just, you know, hit whatever you want with. Then there's Merc Strider, 4 mana, 3/2. Processor, when it enters the battlefield, you may put a card your opponent owns from exile into the player's graveyard. If you do, return target creature to its owner's hand. So a nice little bounce spell. Boing! Off you go, back to your owner's hand, you 8 mana monstrosity. Then Oblivion Sower, not a processor, but does very similar work. 6 mana for a 5/8 Eldrazi. When you cast it, target opponent exiles the top 4 cards of his or her library. Put any number of land cards that player owns from exile onto the battlefield under your control. So say you've exiled 50 of their cards. There's about 20 lands in there. This ramps you by 20 lands. It's just so good in this style of deck. Okay, our commander's going to be much smaller, but we've got 20 more mana. You know what I mean? It's yin and yang, really. Amazing card for the deck. Then there's Ulamog, the Ceaseless Hunger. 10 mana, 10/10 Eldrazi. When you cast it, exile 2 target permanents. That's anything. Could be lands, could be Blightsteel Colossuses. It just gets rid of the 2 biggest threats on the field. It's indestructible, and whenever it attacks, defending player exiles the top 20 cards of his or her library. Ooh, that's pretty good. It's +20/+20 to our commander. Yeah, I'd take it. Fair enough, Ulamog. You're all right with me. Then the Sire of Stagnation. 6 mana, 5/7 Eldrazi. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under an opponent's control, that player exiles the top 2 cards of his or her library, and you draw 2 cards. So we're adding to the sort of mill exile archetype, and we're accelerating our own game plan with card draw. And this really disincentivizes our opponents from playing lands, which is very powerful, and you wouldn't think it is, but there's going to be a lot of situations where you can ramp this out really quickly, say on turn 4, and your opponents are just sat there with 3 lands, like, well, I need to play a land. And then you're just going to be drawing tons of cards. It turns into a consecrated Sphinx of sorts. And it's an Eldrazi, so I absolutely adore it. And that brings me on to number 1. And at number 1, well, what have we got? We've got Dorothy Voidwalker. And this section of cards is all about cards where you're exiling things, but then you can use them yourself. You're exiling and stealing. That's what this is about. 2 black mana for a 3/2. Dorothy Rogue. It's got shadow, so it can't block. It can only be blocked and block creatures with shadow. If a card we put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, instead exile it with a void counter on it. So even though it has that void counter, it's still in exile, so it still counts for our commander. Then tap and sacrifice it. Choose an exile card an opponent owns with a void counter on it. You may play it this turn without paying its mana cost. Oh, that is phenomenal. And the cool thing about all these exile cards, you know, exiling from graves, a lot of ways that mill decks lose is they have like an Eldrazi Titan, like the original Ulamog, the original Kozilek in the deck, and it hits the graveyard and puts everything back in. But if we're exiling everything, who really cares? Ulamog goes to exile, and then, well, what are you going to do? Yes, you shuffle your graveyard in, but we're just going to exile it anyway. And this card, well, if we exile Ulamog, we get to cast it for free. Amazing card and works superbly in the deck. Don't know what that accent was. Terribly sorry for that. Then Mind Flayer the Shadow, 7 mana for a 9/9 horror, so it works with the archetype we were talking about before. It isn't a creature unless you control 3 or more other permanents you don't own. At the beginning of your end step, exile the bottom card of each opponent's library face down. For as long as those cards remain exiled, you may look at them, you may cast permanent spells from among them, and you may spend mana as though in mana of any colour to cast those spells. So this just steals things from underneath, from the upside down. Stranger Things. But this is going to be coming in a magic variant, so don't worry, you don't have to buy the Secret Lair. But this card is just brilliant. It fits the horror theme, it exiles cards, we get to steal them and cast them. Amazing card and just works perfectly in the deck. Then there's the Author of Shadows. 5 mana for a 3/3 Shady Warlock. You're so shady, Warlock. When it enters the battlefield, exile all cards from all opponents' graveyards. Choose an online card exiled this way. You may cast that card for as long as it remains exiled, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any colour to cast this spell. So we've just milled all of our opponents for like 70 cards each. We get to choose from all those 210 cards, that one's the best. And then we get to cast it at some point, and everything else goes to exile. Our commander, he's ballooned. He's just, he's very top heavy. His head's become massive with all that knowledge of exile. So, blind eternities. Anyway, Hedonist Trove, 7 mana for an enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, exile all cards from target opponent's graveyard. You may play land cards exiled with Hedonist Trove, and you may cast non-land cards exiled with Hedonist Trove. You can't cast more than one spell this turn. So this is a great card, but with all of this exile sort of shenanigans we've got going on from the graveyard, you will run into situations where you just don't have anything to steal this. It's just going to be a 7 mana card rotting in your hand. But if you get this out early, it is amazing and does some real shiny work. Then there's Manomic Betrayal, 3 mana for a sorcery. Exile all cards from all opponents' graveyards. You may cast those cards this turn, and you spend mana as though it were mana of any type to cast those spells. At the beginning of the next end step, if any of those cards remain exiled, return them to the owner's graveyard. Exile Manomic Betrayal. So this is, a very temporary exile, but that can give us one big turn to swing in with our commander. And then we can bring them all back and then exile them some other way. But being able to steal anything is just wonderful. And just for 3 mana, great card. Then there's Nightveil Spectre, a slightly different take on the exile theme. 3 mana, 2/3 flyer. When it deals combat damage to a player, that player exiles the top card of his or her library. You may play cards exiled with Nightveil Spectre. So again, we're just going to be stealing things, casting spells, playing lands off this. And, it's a good time all around. Fits well. 3 devotion to both black and blue. Ooh, who remembers that from Standard? Then there's Drauga Necromancer, 4 mana for a 4/4 zombie cleric. If a non-token creature an opponent controls would die, exile a card with an ice counter ice on it instead. You may cast spells from among cards you can exile your opponent's own with ice counters on them. That's a sentence and a half. And you may spend mana from snow sources as though it were mana of any colour to cast the spell. So this really incentivizes you to play snow basics. There's no real downside to playing snow basics, but having this card in there, the snow basics will make any mana, any colour of mana. So a great card to include in the deck. And those are my top 5 cards for this brand new commander. Really quite cool. I love playing with the Exile Zone, especially the Eldrazi processors. I just think they're so cool and they work so well in this deck. So have fun with them. Hopefully you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please do like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you later. Bye.